Ever wonder if everyone is getting dumber? A sense that stupid people are not only getting influence and power, but that they're growing in number and confidence, proudly brain rotting together like out of a movie. It feels forbidden, wrong to suggest that society as a whole is experiencing a dumbing down. But could there be truth to the idea of a stupidity epidemic? Or might there be things even bigger and darker going on? Put the clues together and solve a mass mystery. A decaying of our democracies that, left undeterred, might demolish what we hold dear. First, the vision of a great dumbing has become familiar in our culture. The 2006 film Idiocracy follows an average guy from our time who awakens in the future as the smartest man alive. That's because over generations, the human race had devolved into morons. Thanks to Wikipedia, the greatest work of intellectual altruism in human history, I was tipped off to two stories that served as predecessors for Idiocracy. One of them, Kornbluth's 1951 The Marching Morons, had a very similar story. A man awakens in a future where people had been getting dumber by the day. Now, Idiocracy's premise is a problem. The best off, the rich elites are at the top because their genes are better. The lower folks have the inferior gene pool and again deserve their place. Just a little seasoning of eugenics. But the film is a comedy, and the stupid people are having stupid babies is funny. That the plot felt familiar, that people could resonate, gave this cult classic a truthy vibe. Some got the uncanny feeling they were not watching a parody about a stupid future, but a documentary about the present. But is there any evidence to back up this feeling? The answer is a useful German word, Jein, combining yes and no into a single word. Intelligence is hard to measure, but here's the first clue in our mystery. Some data. 1. IQ has been dropping, slightly. There is evidence that after rising through most of the 20th century, IQs have dropped for those born after 1975. A 2023 paper showed declines in 3 of 4 tested domains. Here is a disclaimer on IQ scores. Second, there is evidence of a literacy crisis in this country. My friend Jared Henderson has a couple great videos on this topic, which I'm leaning on here. There's an increasing rate of functional illiteracy, of Americans unable to handle basic living and basic workplace tasks. Of those of us that are able to functionally read, we're reading less, particularly books. Alongside literacy, numeracy, aka the ability to understand and apply numbers, has stagnated, according to global measures by the OECD. But my imaginary producer's already in my ear complaining. IQ's declining? That's a really squishy metric, at best. And literacy and numeracy declining? That's likely a failure of the education system. The educators, not the educated. And that's a good transition to more systemic considerations. What if our capacity for intelligence hasn't decreased, but rather that we're being held back from reaching our fullest potentials by our environment? What if our economic, medical, and food systems are dragging us down from our best and brightest? For example, it turns out if you're overworked and stressed about money, you might act dumber. Researchers have studied the effects of poverty on brain function, and results suggest concerns about time and finances can worsen decision-making. A drop in cognitive function similar to a 13-point dip in IQ. The mental health crisis must shoulder its share of the blame too. Depression and anxiety have been correlated negatively with executive function, mental processing speed, memory, attention, and yes, a dip in measured IQ. So there we go. IQs are declining. Nobody can read or do math. We're all overworked, depressed, and anxious to the point of mental decline. Mystery solved. Even were these data conclusive to show a great dumbing down of society, and they're not, in my opinion, they still wouldn't explain the gravity of the situation, the selfishness, the constant companion of stupidity, the rot in our politics and personal lives, the sneaking suspicion that not only are other people getting stupider, maybe we're one of them, a worsening version of ourselves. You might already be thinking about the next clue in our mystery. To figure out the pandemic of dumb, we need to talk about these little scrolling suckers. We need to talk about tech and media. Phone fear is everywhere. We sense our devices are making us worse, and we often feel powerless to do anything about our hours of daily screen time. Studies have suggested we prefer electroshocks over 10 minutes of device-free time with our own thoughts. The idea that our technology is not a tool but a parasite draining our brains contributes to the sense of a stupidity epidemic. Gen Z even came up with a word for it: brain rot, Oxford's 2024 Word of the Year. But it's not just Memers and edgelords worried about us masses locked to our glowing feeds. In 2011, a series of studies captured headlines. The Google effect, later digital amnesia, was a tendency for people to forget things they could look up online, a mental offloading. The same year, Nicholas Carr published his book, The Shallows, arguing the internet's synthesized writing, the scanning, scrolling, and skimming was hampering our ability to think deeply. Our malleable minds were being rewired, fragmented. Over a decade later, and the ever-contested evidence is pointing further in a bad direction. Years of studies and meta-analyses on social media and smartphones point to shortened attention spans, brain areas with reduced volume and gray matter, decreased verbal intelligence, and lower cognitive functioning. Enter big tech to make things worse with the attention economy and filter bubbles. By showing us the worst versions of the other side, internet companies strip-mined our sense of justice. Our righteous indignation pointed towards one another to keep us scrolling and seeing advertising. I think this is part of the explanation of the perceived stupidity epidemic. Yes, social feeds tended to send us down ever more radical paths, but more importantly, they convinced us that our fellow citizens were striking out on even more extreme journeys. And if there was any doubt that reasonable people were going extinct, all you had to do was scroll past one more ad to find the next outrage. That is to say that perhaps our belief that the world is getting stupider, that those around us are getting dumber, is a misattribution of something darker. Maybe we just hate each other. Pretty easy to believe someone you hate is a moron. I was recently on a live stream with my friend Dr. Hall Patton, and I expressed a thought on our relationship to our devices, a flowing relationship between what we create and how we are. That is to say, we choose technology. There is a moment when each of us picks up a smartphone for our inaugural scroll, but at a certain point, this content consumes us in return, a domination of the mind. I was thinking of 1964's The Medium is the Message by Marshall McLuhan, which treats our technologies as extensions of ourselves. Later thinkers like Neil Postman in 1985's Amusing Ourselves to Death would apply this thinking to television. TV would come to rewire our brains, change how we think. Our thought begins to mimic the nature and depth of our consumption, and we're worse for it. By replacing the long, patient logic of the written word with television, Postman argued, our society lost some of its capacity for critical thinking, and thus for determining truth. Now leave the 1980s and bring this analysis to the 2020s world of social media scrolling, of short-form vertical video, the dominant medium of our time. If this is the medium, what is the message? That truth itself must be short and it must be angry. How could such a standard not make us dumber? So our statistics decline. We're overworked and sick. Our attention is strip-mined for anger algorithms that replace deep thinking with shallow fragments. Our content itself, by the very nature of the medium, dumbed down. Our malleable minds adopt the slop. Does all that explain the stupidity epidemic? I think there's one critical, massive clue missing, the one we really don't want to think about. What if short-sighted, simple, stupid, and angry interpretations of reality actually suit our culture quite well? What if we actually like things this way? This book I'm holding up awkwardly is called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. It was published in 1963, won the Pulitzer Prize. I think I read this thing for the first time in political science undergrad, though in writing this video I realized I've lost my original copy. Anyway, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. I've linked it below. One of Hofstadter's insights is that intellectual thinking has always been met with a fluctuating level of suspicion. Our anti-intellectualism, he writes, is in fact older than our national identity. Americans have always valorized the self-made man, the common sense roll-up sleeve doer, over the contemplative. To be intellectual was to be lost in the clouds, never really contributing. Socrates might have stated that the unexamined life was not worth living, but had he ever been a farmer or earned a profit? Think of the populist preacher of one of the Great Awakenings, democratizing faith by making it simple and bringing it close to the people. Who needs stuffy, university-educated theologians in their pretentious robes when salvation was suddenly near, so say this everyman in the revivalist tent. Think of someone who in the 1950s might attack an egghead expert. During McCarthy's Red Scare, academics were held as unmanly and un-American. It was the, quote, Harvard professors, twisted thinking intellectuals, against the men equally loaded with honesty and common sense. Think of the populist politician offering simple, common sense solutions. Perhaps they come from the practical world of business or refer to their audience as folks. Lincoln and Douglas might have captivated audiences for hours and hours of nuanced quasi-academic debates in 1858, but those days are done. President Lincoln gave speeches at an 11th grade level. Certain popular politicians of the last decades have hit 6th, flirted with 5th. Isaac Asimov put it this way in 1980. Politicians have routinely striven to speak the language of Shakespeare and Milton as ungrammatically as possible in order to avoid offending their audiences by appearing to have gone to school. By the way, Asimov echoed Hofstadter, calling our disposition an American cult of ignorance, whereby my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. When faced with a choice of a person who did it with their own two hands or a person who did it with their own mind, Americans always choose the former. When deciding to give attention to a nuanced perspective or a slapback soundbite generator, Americans always choose the latter. But Hofstadter wrote that anti-intellectualism ebbed and flowed in American history. He therefore ended his book with a dash of optimism. It is possible, of course, he wrote, that the culture of the future will be dominated by single-minded men of one persuasion or another. It is possible, but one lives in the belief that it is not to be so. Unfortunately, one of Hofstadter's intellectual successors, Susan Jacoby, said his optimism was misplaced. She wrote in 2008, "The scales of American history have shifted heavily against the intellectual life, so essential to functional democracy." And I think she's right. It's not just that numbers for intelligence might be trending down or that social media feeds us stupid that makes us stupid. It's that a critical mass of people might be okay with it, or perhaps easily tricked into believing that ignorance is strength. The pandemic of dumb is here because we invited it. And that's the dark message, the X factor. I assert what we have thus far called the stupid epidemic, the idea that we're all getting dumber, angrier, more selfish. It's actually a crisis of citizenship. What we see manifest in daily life or in our electoral politics are mere symptoms, not the problem itself. We are sick as individuals. We are sick as a society. We have lost what it means to have a healthy civic life. So what the hell do we do about it? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian in prison for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, had several notable lines on the matter of stupidity. Most famously, he wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. Against stupidity, we are defenseless." But I want to bring your attention to Bonhoeffer's diagnosis of stupidity rather than its effects. He went on to describe stupidity like an affliction of an individual, a mental block. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical, and when facts are irrefutable, they are pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In this passage, Bonhoeffer is imagining an argument, presumably with a supporter of fascism. As the person becomes committed to the group ideology, they become immune from outside reason. The individual is lost, subsumed into the mass. And this rings true to anyone who's passionately disagreed with someone. Your first instinct is to just dismiss them as a stupid person, as Bonhoeffer does. And maybe they are stupid, but maybe they aren't. Maybe they're average. Hell, maybe they're smart. Even intelligent people are capable of believing crazy things. The point is that the diagnosis in this situation shouldn't automatically be idiocy. Instead, as Bonhoeffer affects me to think, the true problem is that once an individual is consumed by a group, once it's part of their identity, they're gone. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung had a more concise way of expressing the same idea. The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual. But I think Jung and Bonhoeffer are using the wrong framing. There is no separation between us and the stupid people, nor the evil people for that matter. The individual is not lost in groups. They were never separate from us to begin with, nor us from them. I realize this can come off like hippie talk in a country with deep-seated individualism, but hear me out. Humans are not interchangeable parts of a machine. We are sewn together. The problem people are not an infestation, they are a growth on the body. Amputation is not possible. Only self-immolation, as in Spain in the 1930s or the US in the 1860s. When one so-called group imagines itself targeting outsiders, attempts retribution for whomever they blame for society's woes, they inevitably fail, for when they try to hurt others, they hurt themselves, their children, grandchildren, the civil society from which they sprung. It is a self-laceration, an inverse prostration, performed until the back breaks. It is not hate of others, it is self-loathing, and self-destructive loathing at that. What I'm saying is that stupidity, like democracy, is not an individual condition, it's a collective one, and therefore the cure to the stupidity epidemic is civil restoration, not to wait every 4 years for a chance to be relieved or dismayed, but an active renewal of community, the ongoing effort of citizenship. In November 2024, I posted for the very first time on my Substack on this very topic, a list of prescriptions for a renewal of citizenship. Check that out, subscribe to my Substack, and read a far longer and more detailed version of this script that I posted like a week ago. Heads held high. Happy Warriors. Later, y'all.